Hello, everyone, and welcome to CodeCast by STL Tech Talk, where we are going to bring you the content you want and need: instructional, informative, unique, and insightful commentary on programming, code, and technology. Coming to you live, my name is JJ Hammond, and I'm joined tonight by two coding experts. Up first, our guest, an international speaker, Microsoft MVP, ASP Insider, MCSD, CSM, and CSP. If you love those acronyms, I'm sure we can come up with some more. Also, a passionate member of the developer community, a .NET developer for the last 30 years, and heavily involved in the Agile community since 2005. He is lead director for the Cincinnati .NET Users Group and the Cincinnati Software Architect Group, co-hosts the Hallway Conversations podcast, founded the Cincinnati Day of Agile, and volunteers for the National Ski Patrol. Say hello to the genius, Phil Japikse. If I said that right, Japikse.
No, that's all right. That's why I go by Ski Medic. Nobody gets it right.
Fantastic. Well, hello, Phil, and thank you so much for being on the show, sir.
Hey, thank you for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Yes, all the above. It is our pleasure to have you on, but our show is not possible without my fellow co-host, striving to bring development knowledge to the masses, and spent the last 20 years architecting and implementing highly scalable ASP.NET applications, our very own Gus Emery. Hello, Gus.
Hello, everyone. Hey, Phil. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey,
Golf
glad to have you.
Are you ready for a fantastic show, sir?
I am. Are you, Phil?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Awesome.
Let's do it.
Great, me too. And don't forget, everyone, you can follow us on Twitter, hashtag CodeCast, or at STL CodeCast. Also, you can find us on Facebook, STL Tech Talk, Google+, subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or listen to us live directly from our site. And don't forget, you can follow all of our information and site going and happenings, where you can catch up with our tech news, podcast, codecast, programming code, hands-on reviews, event coverage, and much, much more. And don't forget, you can interact with the show by sending us feedback to podcast@stltechtalk.com. And if you're watching us live, you can ask us questions via the chat room, and we will do our best to answer those questions in a timely manner. Special thank yous go out tonight to Brian Noyes, our last guest. So thank you again for being on the show. That was a really good talk, really good episode, and looking forward to having you on again in the future. Also, I wanted to take a moment to thank our sponsors of the show, Inertia Software, creating cutting-edge, highly scalable Microsoft technological solutions to the energy industry. Go to inertia-software.com to see how you can be working with them. So without further ado, let's kick off the show with the very first question to Phil. What got you into pursuing a career in technology?
Well, it's funny. It was kind of, I fell into it. My father was an exec with Procter & Gamble for many, many years, and back in the late 70s, early 80s, no, late 70s, he came home with a computer and didn't know what to do with it, but all the execs at Procter & Gamble had to have a computer, so he brought it home and it sat there. So I went down to the library and got some programming magazines and started writing code and realized that I really don't like to lose. So as I would put these games into the computer, I'd make sure I have little back doors so I could always beat all my friends. And it just grew from there. I actually wanted to be a doctor.
Really?
And then I took AP Anatomy in high school, and I realized I didn't want to be a doctor.
Pretty quick.
And it wasn't the anatomy. I mean, I spent 15 years as a firefighter paramedic, so I can handle the medical stuff, but it's like 400 years of school to become a doctor.
Yeah, for sure. It's like, you ready to be a doctor? Oh, yeah, I'm ready to be a... Yeah, you got to wait about 7 to 8 years.
Yeah, and then pay off for another 20, and then by the time you're 50, maybe you're breaking even.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. That's why you always go to the people with white hair.
Absolutely.
They've been around the block for a while.
Yeah, they were able to pay off their debts, so they must have some sort of business acumen.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So, how did you? So you're like me. I'm a sore winner and a sore loser. But that sounds pretty cool. What type of games were you able to manipulate?
Oh, well, this was the late 70s, so it wasn't much. It was a lot of kind of text. One was Sub Hunt. I don't know if you remember Sub Hunt. I think I'm probably the oldest one on this podcast, but I basically made atomic depth charges. So I could drop it and clear the entire screen.
That's perfect.
That is awesome. That is awesome.
That's the one way to get ahead, right, Phil?
Cheap. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, a lot of people talk about Commodore. Some other people have talked about different things that got them into it. So, what was that transition like then? I mean, why go the technological route? Because like you said, paramedic, firefighter stuff. Why did you decide to go this way?
Well, so I actually went to school. I went to Washington University in St. Louis, and the reason I fell into WashU was a buddy of mine was coming out to look at the School of Architecture, and we liked Anheuser-Busch products, and I thought, hey, if I'm going to visit a college, why not visit one in St. Louis? And I came out, and they had the application process back then in the 80s, where it was one page front and back and a 50-word essay, and I'm like, that's it, because I was looking at University of Illinois and MIT and some others, and they had books you had to write.
Right.
So I filled it out when I was there, long hair and all, and handed it in, and they looked at my transcript and they said, when can you start?
Nice.
Perfect.
So, I went to school. It was one of the first schools of the time that actually had computer science in engineering school, so I have an engineering degree.
Nice.
Whereas most of the schools back then, it was a business degree.
Right, business or a mathematics degree with a minor in IT or whatever the case is.
Right.
Yeah, which is kind of weird because they're shifting back to that a little. I don't know. It's a whole thing. So then, tell me a little bit about that journey, though. I mean, did you keep into those other areas just as interests, or did you just apply your knowledge and make yourself better? Obviously, you're awesome at what you do. Did you just throw all of your time and energy to coding and programming?
Not so much coding and programming as much as solving problems and putting out fires. I was doing the firefighter paramedic thing alongside programming, so there's many times where I was up all night and then still dragging my butt into the client in the morning.
So it's not a cliche when you say you put up fires out, because you literally put fires out and metaphorically put fires out that people call fires. Right.
Yeah. And so I've never been a language wonk. I'm a C# MVP, but if you compare me to somebody like Bill Wagner, I'm just like, I give, right? Surrender, uncle. But it's really about, I've had this ability, and I think maybe it's because of my medical background and really dealing with patients and trying to figure out, because when they call you, they're like, I feel ill. Well, you have to figure out what ill means. Well, how many times has a customer said, it doesn't work?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or, I want this. And it's like, well, you say you want that, but I don't think that word means what you think it means, right? And it's inconceivable, and you got to go a different direction and really figure that out. And that's the part of the that I really enjoy, and it's one of the reasons why I really enjoy being an architect, not because I want to sit around in an ivory tower and tell people what to do, but I'm at that front end of meeting with the customers and really trying to understand what it is they need and what they want and where that intersects. And then the wickedly smart engineers at Internology build this amazing stuff that I dream up, and it's really nice.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, and it's kind of like so do you like seeing things being deconstructed and then you yourself building that back together? Because I like breaking things and fixing it, because then I know what I'm dealing with. But that's not everybody's approach.
Well, the problem is every time I've broke something and put it back together, I always had an extra part.
You look down. Oh man, that's
right here and right there.
That probably was really important. I'm not gonna lie to you. You probably needed this part of your gut, but
I have an 8-year-old daughter who's riding a bike, and I'm looking at a couple bolts after I built it, and I'm like, well, why don't you ride slow at first, and we'll see how it goes.
Right.
No, I spend a lot of time looking at the bigger picture and trying to really understand. Not so much. I mean, not like big design up front, right? But where are we going to go? Where is this journey going to take us in rough orders of magnitude? I like to call them the big rocks, right? What are the big rocks we're trying to accomplish? And really waiting until the last responsible moment to distill that down into the little rocks.
Right. So you do the chunking or whatever the case may be, as you just break it down to its bare bones minimum, and then go from there and make sure that it makes sense. Because a lot of the times, an idea or an approach is easily found out to be not the right idea or approach when you're doing that deconstruction. So that's kind of interesting that's kind of your approach to it. And the way I think of it's obviously the linked list and nodes and all that, but that's just me. We attended this local hackathon, so that's still in my head because I was watching that amazing work that they were doing. So Gus, you're up.
Yeah, so Phil, I wanted to ask you a question, but I couldn't get a word in edgewise as JJ was yapping, but love you, JJ. What type of computer did your dad bring home?
So the first one he brought home was an MPM machine.
Okay.
And if you know what a CPM machine, it was multiple PM machine. I can't remember what it stands for. So many years ago, it had. I'm trying to remember. They were either 8-inch or 11.5-inch floppies. And you could have everything that you wanted on this floppy, right? And green screen and the whole 9 yards, and you couldn't punch a hole in it like you could with the Apple IIs.
Yep.
Then we got an Apple II. Never did the Trash 80. It was the only time in my life that I had a lot of Apple products. When they switched over to white plugs, I ran away from them.
Yep.
So, but yeah, that was it. So it was. I remember studying for an AP history test, and I've always been better at remembering things after I write them, and I have terrible handwriting. Yeah. And so I took an entire years of notes and typed them into, I think it was Multimate.
Oh, that was a long time ago.
And printed it all on a dot matrix printer. And, of course, my dad was furious because those things were not quiet.
No.
And kept them up all night the night before the AP exam. But yeah, so I've been there from the start. When I was in St. Louis, got a lot of jobs building computers, and you built them and you networked them and then you programmed them and you did everything.
Yep, I remember those days. Well, before the networking anyway, it was the Commodore 64, IBM, Apple bulletin board era, right?
Right.
And then that kind of migrated into the what was it called, FidoNet and ARPANET, right? Weren't those the first two real networking pieces before the internet hit? And the computers are what they are today, anyway.
Yeah, we had email at WashU in 1985.
That's early. That's
never
old.
Never sent an email,
yeah.
But I had an email address. I'm like, what do I do with this? Where do I?
Yeah, what do we do with this? Nobody else has one. How can we utilize this? Mm-hmm. Well, let's get into some of the development now. So what type of applications do you like to create?
I like to create interesting ones. One of the reasons why I had gotten out of consulting 4 years ago when I went to a product company was I had written so many e-commerce applications that were just different enough that we couldn't reuse the majority of stuff, and forms over data and line of business, CRUD apps, and it was driving me crazy.
Yep.
I liked the fact that I could, interpret what people needed, was instrumental in some humongous projects for a Fortune 5 company, and I'm proud of that. But then I'm like, God, yet another one, right? More CRUD, more forms over, and this is, in Hibernate was like, oh my Lord, this is awesome.
Yeah.
Because I don't have to write that same code each time. Got in the product company for the past few years. Now that I'm with Internology, one of the things that really drew me to getting back into consulting is they're doing amazing. I say they because they don't let me write code, right? I'm not smart enough for that. But they're doing amazing stuff with natural user interfaces. And this is what is really getting me excited right now, is taking WPF, Windows 8, living in the XAML world, which I've spent a long time in XAML, but working with things like voice and gesture and touch and multi-touch. And how do you put all that together? And one of the applications they have at IK is a touchless operating room, where you take a Kinect and the doctor, who's elbows deep in the patient, can't touch anything because he'd have to scrub back in, can talk to the computer and say, show me the x-rays, zoom in on an x-ray, pan out, bring up the chart, things like that. And this really getting me excited right now, just the whole next generation. And I think you're going to ask me a question later about where I think it's going to go, and this is absolutely where I think it's going to go.
Yeah, I actually saw a demo of that software at that conference. Fantastic.
Right.
Even though it was a demo, it didn't work very well in the big room. But that being said, Of course it doesn't, because the Kinect has such a good microphone array on it that it's picking up everything. I mean, there's just background noise. That's what happens. Right. But those are fantastic, aren't they? I mean, the way that they can judge depth and skeletons and decipher people is just fantastic.
Yeah, your hand movements, the different, your thumbs, your wrist, all your joint movements and things like that. In fact, I was watching the Microsoft Virtual Academy, I believe it was, and they were showing, when it first came out, the SDK was dropped, and you had your standard templates, and I was at the Microsoft offices here in St. Louis, and we were coding right to it, and it was pretty cool. I mean, just the different use case scenarios for this is obviously. It's a cliche to say this, but it's awesome. It's like the future, and it's really cool. From that whole Minority Report thing. Plus, I just to bring up from the medical standpoint, I've talked about this several times, but just being able to diagnose patients as they're walking into the doctor's office. This, and this is wrong. Or this is right, and maybe we need to go a different route. They can tell perspiration and all this stuff. It's really cool. So I'm looking forward to where it's headed.
Yeah, and I'd love to come back on the show and just do a show based on that, the natural user interface and some of those applications. I know we're going to set the groundwork today with MVVM and WPF, which is you've got to have that good foundation or the house will collapse. But I'd love to come back and show you some of the stuff that you can do with WPF and the Kinect and the voice and everything else.
Oh, we are totally in on that. So that kind of leads me into my next question, which is great because a lot of people are saying that WPF is on the way out. How do you feel about that? What do you think the future holds for that?
Oh, I'm so tired of hearing this. And you're right. People are saying all the time. Why? Because nobody was talking about WPF. And if you're not talking about it, well, they must be killing it off. But if they're killing off WPF, why is XAML built into the Windows 8 operating system? Right? It's up to Windows 8, XAML was bolted on through .NET, and it had its performance issues because of that. But now when we look at Windows 8, XAML is part of the core OS. It's not going away. We're looking at new stuff coming out at in WPF. The WPF team has been actively engaging the community and the MVPs to get feedback. I really think that once they got the Windows 8 release out and got over the JavaScript thing, that the WPF team was like, okay, you guys are allowed outside again. You don't have to hide, and go make magic. And they're continuing to iterate. At WPF, if you're writing a smart client app, there's no better way to do it.
I would tend to agree with you. I like to do a lot of my desktop apps in WPF, whereas I like to do enterprise apps in web just because it's much easier for me to push out, right?
It really depends on what you need, though, right? If you need that richness of the UI, yeah, you can do some of it with HTML5, and we'll get there with HTML5. But there's the things you can do with, especially with natural user interfaces, you can't compete.
And that's where I think the application boundary is, right? What do you need to do compared to what does the application have to do? I mean, you couldn't do the surgery piece with web. It just wouldn't work. I mean, at this point, I don't believe there's a way it would work. I'm sure there will be in the future, and when you have that rich desktop, high graphic utilization things, you actually need the power of the desktop to take care of that, in my opinion.
Right.
And what are your thoughts on the mouse and keyboard approach? I mean, obviously there's different touch user interfaces and different stuff like that. I don't know. And what I see when it comes to Windows, it's a keyboard and mouse. There's not a whole lot of touch.
That's because of the applications that are being built, right? Okay. And because of people like me and Gus, who are old and gray and crotchety and get off my yard.
Yeah. Right, sure.
We grew up with the mouse and keyboard. My kids, who are 13 and 11 and 8, they've all got Surfaces. They never snap on the keyboard. The only time they do is if they're doing a lot of, if they're making a report for school or a presentation for school or things like that. But almost all of their consumption-based activities, mouseless and keyboardless.
I couldn't do that. No. I tried to do that for like a minute, and I'm like, where's my keyboard? I can't do it. I can't do it. I tried, but I can't.
And that's why you have to support both, right? You can't go all in either way, and I think that's part of the some of the places that Microsoft dropped the ball with the first release of Windows 8, right? They were thinking that everybody would throw their keyboard and mouse away just because, right? Field of dreams. And it ended up being the field of broken dreams.
Yeah, well, exactly, because a lot of us, like you said, get off of our keyboard and mouse. We like it, right? And it's going to be around for quite a while, I think, until we get to that point where everyone's familiar and used to doing the gestures and can do that in a touchscreen, etc. You know, more.
Well, but you know, how do you? Anyway. Yeah, but my point is, like, how does one actually do something when they're like on a screen? I don't like, my thumbs can move really quick, but not as nearly as quick as my hand. Like, there is no coding, there is no papers, there is no work that you can do. In my opinion, without a keyboard, you just can't. I'm sorry.
No, you're right. I mean, if you're entering data, you have to have a keyboard. But if you were to go shopping and didn't have to keep clicking around on the screen to narrow your search, I just bought a new webcam tonight. I would love to be able to just look at my computer and do the Star Trek thing. You know, computer. You probably can't see it. I just picked up my mouse and pretended to be Scotty. And nobody on listening is going to get that reference, but that was anyway.
No, they will. I'm a Star Trek fan, so yeah.
But don't think you're Chris Pine.
Walk up to the computer and just talk to it, and then through gesture and voice,
what was that?
I can just kind of sit back in my chair and flap my arms and narrow it down, and then all right, now I'm gonna get the mouse out because now I want to see the different views. I'm gonna add it to the cart. I'm gonna enter my credit card. So I think you can have that hybrid approach.
Okay.
I don't think you can have a touch-only approach for most apps.
Right. And you have to do it right. It can't be, you can't just do it halfway, right? You have to think about the whole encompassing process, because you have to, and I feel like some developers don't do that when they approach their applications. I don't know if it's because time constraints or money or whatever the case may be, is maybe a little bit of both, but I would like to see more of a well-rounded experience.
Well, I think you need an interaction designer. Right?
Yeah.
I am not an interaction designer. I'm an architect. So every application I make is a cylinder, square, circle.
Yeah.
And then I'm done.
Yeah.
But you have to have an interaction designer, and we use them, right, at Interlogy, because we'll be like, all right, here's what the app's going to do. Go make the UI, and it's not just making it pretty. It's actually talking about that user experience, right? How does the flow work? How should the screens be built? Is this touch? Is this gesture? Is this voice? Is this keyboard? Is this mouse? And that's left brain, right brain, right? Developers, I don't think. I mean, if you can find one who's really good at both, hire that person, right?
Yeah,
and because they're going to make a gazillion dollars.
Well, yeah, exactly, because they're going to hit it out of the park every single time.
Right.
Yeah. So, Phil, why MVVM? I heard you say that before. What does that buy developers and applications?
Well, I actually, I don't know if you guys, and again, JJ's going to yell at me because I haven't watched your show, but I've got a few slides that kind of go through that. But, I mean, we can just talk about it, virtually.
Yep, let's do it.
The main thing that you get with MVVM is separation of concerns, right? So if you're a fan of Uncle Bob's solid principles, what we did before in the past, think of WinForms, where all this code was in the code behind. And we couldn't reuse it. We couldn't really test it. We were clipboard inheriting all over the app. If you had an error message on your user interface, it was in the code behind, and then we copied that to every other form. I'm sorry, back then we called them forms. Now we call them windows. We had to change the names with WPF because that way we can sell more books.
Yep. Well, that and Canvas, right? I mean, there's a Canvas.
Well,
too.
Canvas is evil, right? So just Canvas is flat out evil, but that's not an MVVM discussion. and
it's okay. It's your show too. So say.
No, that's fine. We can go a whole hour on Canvas and UI, and I'd rather talk about the patterns right now.
Yep. Yeah. I want to learn.
One of the big things. Well, let's just talk about what MVVM is, right? So it's Model-View-ViewModel. And when you think of the models, those are the things of your application. They're typically persistent. Could be a customer, could be an order, could be your widgets. These are the things you're going to store probably in a database of some type. We won't get into the NoSQL, SQL argument, but it's going to be persistent. Then you have the view, and the view is the window. And I like looking at the model as coffee beans, milk, syrups. I'm a big Starbucks fan. So those things that get stored, that you can put a price on, you have a quantity of, and things like that. The view is the drive-through window. It has no built-in intelligence, right? So you drive up to the window, you talk into a little microphone, you see a big board that displays all the prices, but the board itself doesn't know what those prices mean. It's just displaying data, right?
Okay.
It's just showing stuff to the user. And you know, when you order something, the board itself doesn't start moving pieces of data around to come up with the total, right? The view model or the controller does that, and that's behind the scenes. So continuing with the Starbucks theme, the view model has two different jobs. One is the job of the barista. This would be like the controller if you're thinking of an MVC style application. There is no C in MVVM, and I know that sounds kind of obvious now that I said it out loud. But it's really their job is to process these incoming requests and decide what to do with them. Not handle the requests, but to decide what to do with them. So this is the barista who isn't necessarily making the coffee, but is taking the money, taking the order, putting it in the cash register. And then you've got some worker process making the coffee for you, right? Which could be the database, could be an application server, could be some other set. The other job of the view model is, I look at it as this is the cup with the syrup and the caffeine and the milk and whatever all in one. This is all your different individual models squished together as a transport mechanism so that your view can be tightly coupled to a specific object, right? So you've got all these different things that you need in the view, and you don't want to be constantly sending ones and twosies over to the view. You really just want to package it up in a nice, neat package. You can bind directly the data context, and the data context in WPF, if you're not familiar with WPF, that is what you data bind to. So every item has a data context, but the window also has data context. So in MVVM style, you have a view model, which is a class, which will expose some models. It'll expose some commands. It'll expose some other things, perhaps. And that entire view model is now a supermodel, if you will, and that's what the window's bound to, right? So you've got those two different functions. And so that's kind of the pattern in a raw nutshell. And I've got sample code that I'll give you guys to post on the website. JJ, I assume you post code on the website. I didn't look, so you can yell at me again.
No, but I'll yell at you anyway. No, of course I wouldn't dare dream of that, sir. No, I will definitely. If you shoot that over, we'll have it up on this page.
Yeah, and plus it's also on my blog, so we're going to show that later, I'm sure, and you can get it there. Mm-hmm. So all right, so that's the pattern. So why MVVM? Well, yes. the first thing I want to talk about is dry. Don't repeat yourself. What we find ourselves doing if we're using a typical code behind programming model is we repeat ourselves all over the place. Error messages, event handlers, action items, those types of things. We clipboard inherit from screen to screen to screen. I have long said, and I say this in about every one of my talks, so if any of your listeners have ever seen me live give a talk, I say this every time. If you write something once, think about encapsulating it in the method. If you write the same thing twice, you absolutely have to encapsulate it in the method. If you write the same thing 3 times, I want you to stop being a programmer. Just stop.
Okay.
Right? Because when you start repeating yourself throughout the code, then it becomes a maintenance nightmare. Somebody comes in later, they're looking at a specific execution path, and they say, oh, okay, we accept 3 types of credit cards. Let me add the 4th type of credit card, but they only add it in that one particular place, and the rest of the application still only accepts 3. Right? So you get all these side effect bugs because you don't know that there's 17 copies of this if-then-else statement.
So
right?
The code kind of goes like this.
Yeah.
Way over here.
Right. And so when you look at what your view model is doing for you, it's exposing things like commands. It's exposing things like, well, I mean, commands is the most obvious because that's usually what you're programming. And that command can then be repeated on different views. Right? So that's the big one, is don't repeat yourself. So it really helps us keep our code encapsulated. The other one, separation concerns, and the one I always show, the picture I show for this when I give this talk, is Bones. Bones McCoy from Star Trek. Because what does he always say? Damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a fill in the blank.
Right.
And when we put all this code in the code behind, now we're trying to be the engineer, we're trying to be the weapons specialist, we're trying to be the security guard, we're trying to be the captain, and he's really just a good doctor. Right? So let him do what he does best, and don't have all these artificial responsibilities put on something like a view. You know, should the view be saving data? Well, what if you change out the data model and you go from XML files to a database to a NoSQL type store to a REST service? Now, every time that view or any of your views gets or puts data, you have to update all that code, right? Because you've repeated yourself because you haven't separated the concerns out. So you have very small methods, very small classes that just do what they're good at and nothing else.
I like that.
So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes total sense.
Okay, one thing I have to throw out there, because I hear this all the time and it drives me crazy, the goal of MVVM is not to have zero code behind. The goal of MVVM is to be solid, right? Single responsibility, open, close, list-scope segregation, interface, list-scope substitution, interface segregation, dependency inversion, separation of concerns, and have clean code. Now, by doing that and following the MVVM pattern, you will probably almost never have code in the code behind. But you don't go into this saying, ooh, I have 4 lines in a code behind. I did it wrong. Maybe there's a good justification for those 4 lines. You're always going to have 2. Right? One is initialize component, which you have to have, or otherwise your window will not render. And the other one is when you set the data context. Now, some people will say you should set the data context in XAML. I say no, because then you can't change it. So why would I want to change the data context? Well, let's look at a simple e-commerce type application, because everybody understands e-commerce. I'm probably not a good candidate for WPF, but everybody understands the concepts. So now I have a catalog, and the catalog pages are all built exactly the same. What's different is what we're showing on those pages. So let's say we do a search, and now we have a subset of the whole catalog. Should we really build a whole new view for automotive, or can we use the same view for everything and just change the data? Well, if you bind the data context in the code behind, you can use something like an inversion of control, dependency injection, those types of things, to pass in the view model and say, by the way, this is your new view model, and this is what you care about, right? So you get that additional separation of concerns by not putting it in the XAML.
Gotcha.
Okay, makes sense.
So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Very much.
All right. So any questions on that? Because the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at code.
Let's look at code.
Yay! That's my favorite part.
All right. New to Google Hangouts. Let's make sure I share this correctly. You should be seeing, yes, you are seeing Visual Studio 2013 for what I am doing. You need Visual Studio 2013.
Yes.
If you want 2012, you can still do that, but it's an older version of WPF. There are some really nice things in .NET 4.5 that we're going to talk about that make the MVVM pattern cleaner to implement. There's still some things that aren't even there with Roslyn. This version of Roslyn that we'll talk about some extra lines of code you have to write. But let's look at this stupid little application, and I'm sharing the entire screen, so you should see it. And you can tell that it's WPF because it's Battleship White, right? This has not been handled by an interaction designer. This has been handled by Phil, who doesn't know. I know 4 colors, right? I know the 3 primary colors in fuchsia, so we just stick with Battleship White. But the first thing I want to talk about, and before we really jump into code, somebody's probably thinking, and I don't think there's any questions in the chat window yet, which MVVM framework is your favorite? And I'm going to be the architect. I'm going to say it depends. I never talk about specific frameworks in this talk because what I want all the people to understand is what the pattern is, why it matters, and how WPF and XAML supports the pattern, and then they can decide by looking at the different frameworks what best matches their business needs. So some of the stuff I'm going to show can be done a little easier using one of the frameworks, but again, I don't want to cloud anybody's judgment by just showing a framework. So the first thing I want to talk about that's built into WPF is this whole concept of change notification. Now, if you come from a WinForms background, and even in the web prior to SignalR, we always had to do this dot refresh, right? So I have a grid on the screen, the data changed, I better call refresh on the grid to make sure the grid's current. I've got a master detail, they changed the selected item in the combo box, oh my gosh, we better call refresh, right? We're constantly littering it with refresh, and we call it 10 more times than we need because we're so paranoid that stuff's going to get out of sync. Well, with the change notification built into WPF and XAML, and this works in Windows 8 as well, then I can, ooh, that was an interesting little graphical glitch I have while I'm sharing my screen. I don't know how well you can see that, Gus. Maybe you can tell me, is that way too small?
I can see it just fine, but that's an interesting glitch.
Yeah, I changed the screen size. We'll blame Google for that because Google's fun to blame. So I'm sitting here updating the price, and you see the form is changing, right? The values are changing. I've got 2 products in here right now. I'm going to add a new product, and now you see 3 products in my dropdown. And you're probably thinking, okay, Phil, this is Hello World in WinForms. We've all been able to do this. And you're absolutely right. You have been able to do this. But what I really want to show you is the fact that, let me get to change notification. Let's go to the view. Here's the view. Let's look at the code behind for the view. And I have 2 lines of code. Initialize component, and I assign the change notification view model. And by the way, that's kind of the naming convention we do. So if you've got a change notification view, the view model is typically named change notification view model. It allows you to sit at the cool kids table if you do that. You can name it whatever you want. There's no rules around it. But we go into the view model, and I probably should have picked a white background. Gus, do I need to make that font any bigger?
No, it's good.
Okay.
I can read it fine.
So all the view model does is exposes a list of products as an observable collection. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, so just think about that and make sure I come back, keep me honest. But let's look at the actual product. And my product, my model, implements iNotifyProperty changed. Now all this adds is one event. The property changed event. And Visual Studio made that noise. Anytime I scroll, I have a little add-in that makes a noise, so that's why it went. When the property change event gets raised, XAML knows to say, oh, okay, something has changed. Let me refresh. And so at the model level, the thing that knows when it changes, right, separation of concerns, it knows it's changed. It tells the world, hey, I've changed. If you're listening, then please update yourself. So that's the property changed event. The way we call it is very simple. So here we have, let's look at the model name, property. So we just have a regular string property, getter and setter, with a backing field. And this is one of those things that I wish it was less code, but it's actually pretty easy with ReSharper. You can just write a template, and it plops it right out there for you. But on the setter, we check to make sure that the value really changed. This is just defensive programming, nothing new there. If it hasn't really changed, then we just return. Otherwise, we update the value, and then we call this onPropertyChanged event. Or actually, it's a method that will call the event. So let's look at the onPropertyChanged method, and we have this new attribute that you have in .NET 4.5, caller member name. What this will do is assign to that variable, and I call it field name, the name of the method that called this method. So I don't have to pass around strings. So if the model name changed, the field name would get set to model name. Then all I have to do is raise the event. Of course, we have to check to make sure somebody's listening. That's typical eventing, nothing new there. And then we call the property, we raise the property changed event, passing in a new property changed event args. Now you'll notice I have string.empty in there. So why did I pass in the member name if I have string.empty? This is demo code, and I always want to show 2 different ways of calling it. If you call if you add in string.empty to the property change event args, every property in this instance of this model will get refreshed. So the entire model gets refreshed. If you pass in a specific field name, only that field name gets refreshed. So why do I call string.empty? That might be a performance hit. I've written a lot of WPF apps. I've never had that be a performance hit. I've been burned by Visual Studio going all the way back to Visual Studio 1 and WinForms and Classic ASP. I am paranoid and old and cranky. I just want to have everything updated. But the accepted standard is to pass in a field name. So that's just, again, me being old and crotchety. But either one works, right? Because theoretically, if any other field name was changed, then it would raise the property change event handler, and you wouldn't have to worry about it getting out of sync. So that's one of the ways that we keep the model always in sync with the view. The other thing, I told you there's this observable collection thing. For a single class, we have something called iNotifyPropertyChanged. We also have iNotifyCollectionChanged. And if you want to write your own list that implements it, the more power to you. I think I probably did that in sophomore year at Washington University. It's a waste of time. All you really need to do, because Microsoft was very nice and gave us a generic class called Observable Collection that takes in any IEnumerable. So in the view model, I create a new observable collection for any list that I have. I don't need it on the model side, because typically at the model level, you're not doing collections, right? You're doing individual models that will then be put into a collection. So now I have an observable collection, and it will get notified. The view gets notified anytime anything is added, removed, changed, etc., etc. Now, I have these little bit of a mismatch here of where my notification events are happening, right? And the observant listener is going, well, Phil, you said you want to keep everything on the model side, but you've got iNotifyCollectionChange in the view model, and you've got iNotifyPropertyChange on the model. This was a humongous debate when WPF first came out. There were all kinds of people arguing, getting in purse fights, throwing shoes at each other about whether you should have an anemic model or an anemic view model. And the difference is very simple. Whichever one's anemic doesn't have any eventing. So if you have an anemic view model, then it doesn't subscribe to iNotifyPropertyChange, and its objects don't subscribe to iNotifyPropertyChange. If you have an anemic model, then it doesn't have the property change events in it. What I do and what I recommend, and a lot of people have come this way, not because I was saying it, I think I got lucky and I picked the right way in the beginning, is I like to have a little bit of a combination. I want my models to not be anemic. I want every single model, because it knows when it's changed, to raise the iNotify or the property changed event, because it knows best when it's changed. That also means I only have to write that code once. So if product did not implement iNotifyPropertyChanged, anytime I used a product in the view model, I would have to implement iNotifyPropertyChanged on that product, which is repeating a lot of code. And if I write code 3 times, I have to quit programming, so I need to make sure that I'm not repeating code. The observable collection, I'm saying I'll put it in the view model because Microsoft wrapped it up in a nice pretty bow, and it's no extra work for me. I'm not implementing this collection and implementing the interface. I'm just saying, hey, Microsoft gave me this toy, I'm going to use it because it's awesome. So that's the notification, the whole change notification process built into XAML. So that right there makes it a whole lot cleaner. You also notice that the view model, like I said, is kind of acting like a controller. I've got some commands here. We're going to talk about commands in more detail later, but you see that I'm not doing any sort of business logic, any sort of real code in the view model. It's just saying, hey, I'm a broker. Oh, you want to change the price? Fine. Let me call the price updater command. And I'm not very good at naming things. The 3 hardest things in programming are naming conventions and off by 1 errors. That was kind of funny. But I know you guys are muted, so I'm pretending you're laughing.
It's hilarious. No, I do that all the time. I'm just like, God, I don't want to come up with another variable name or whatever. It's just like, I don't want to do this anymore. It's like, we need a random generator for that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Or call everything a manager. Doesn't matter what it is.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of a code smell to C manager, but that's another episode. But so now I've got this thing that updates the price of a product. So anytime I need to update the price of a product, I can use this same command. So I'm getting code reuse. The model itself doesn't need to know how to update itself. This business logic knows how to update it, and I can reuse it. So now I'm getting not only single reuse, but I'm not repeating myself, right? I've got this encapsulated logic to do it. So again, it's looking at a very simple view model, but they don't get a whole lot more complex than this in the code that I write. So that's the whole observable thing, right? And that's an observable pattern that you really have to understand. So does that make sense? Okay.
Does to me.
Sorry, I know you guys said you were going to mute, and I keep asking these questions because I'm so used to giving this live, and you're going, oh, we're not mic'd. All right, let's talk about validation. And this is a big one because this is the code that we have hated to write forever. So I've got, again, my silly little products, and I've got some business rules. If inventory is greater, or inventory has to be greater than 0, and it should be on sale if inventory is greater than 50. So let's make the inventory 55, and you'll see that the sale price now has changed its look. It now has an adorner, and I can hover over the tooltip, and it says foo must be marked down due to stock quantity greater than 50. Now again, you're probably thinking, we've written this code thousands of times for the web, for WinForms, all over the place. What's so exciting about this? Well, I'm going to tell you that again, when we look at the validation, and here's our view, and we look at the code behind, 2 lines of code. Initialize component set to view model. Let's look at the view model. There must be logic here, because otherwise, how would it work? Wait, no. The view model, there aren't even any commands. It's just exposing a list of products. So how does this work? Well, we get encapsulation. When we look at the product again, we're going to look at another interface called iDataErrorInfo. iDataErrorInfo gives us 2 things. It gives us a string indexer on the model, and it gives us an error method, or a property. Now, the error property isn't used by WPF. You're more than welcome to use it yourself, but let's go look at this string indexer. So anytime, now this won't work without notify property change. So anytime a property is changed and the data binding says, oh, look, something changed, it will then call the string indexer if it exists, and this code will run. So here I have a rule that if the string passed in, now unfortunately these are magic strings, and if we had a longer show I could tell you how I work around that, but let's get through the basics first. Inventory cannot be less than 0, and I'm returning a string. And the way this works is anytime there's a non-empty string returned, there's an error. The binding framework knows that an error has occurred, and it will look for certain things I'm going to show you in a minute. If you return just string.empty, there's no error. Everybody's happy. Go on, keep playing. So the advantage of this is the model is where you have your error messages. So if inventory has to be greater than a certain number, then it's right here. Now, you can say that's too encapsulated, that inventory is a business rule that can change. Fine. You can have that as a configuration setting. You can have that call into a database field. You can do any number of things to get that value. But the important thing is the message is always created here. Because invariably, when you're getting ready to release, some QA person or some BA is going to come up to you and say, I don't like that message. You need to change that message. And now you have to go onto every single window and change that message. But here, with MVVM, and having that implemented in the model itself, one place to change it. Right? So you truly have that single responsibility. Right? The model knows what its error is and how it should expose that it has an error. All right. So that being said, how do we get the UI to change its look? Well, there's a couple things that happen when iDataErrorInfo says, oops, there's an error. The first thing is that there is a validation object, and if it has error property set to true, then you can set a trigger. And triggers and styles are very, very powerful in WPF. We're not going to get into those today. Just know that when this is true, it's like an event firing. I change the background and the foreground color of the control itself. But there's also this thing called an adorner. And if you think of WPF as multi-layered, where you can have things adorning, you've got a Christmas tree, you adorn it with ornaments, right? You're putting things on top of it. You're not changing the tree itself, you're just decorating it. So the error template is an adorner. And you can define that however you want. And I defined it as a dock panel, where the tooltip for the dock panel is the error that was brought back from the control that is bound to the model property that has the error. So if you look at this, there's no error string in here. It's getting it from the model. So I can have a designer, and I like to talk about the guys and gals that wear the berets and the turtlenecks, make a really pretty adorner, and it doesn't matter from a business logic standpoint if the messaging changes, because that was handled in the model itself. Right? So here we again have separation concerns. We can make it look however we want, so the people that are working in Blend can make this really nice template, much better than what I made, and they can change it and make it look pretty. All they have to do is paste into XAML, referencing the control with the error right here, adorned element placeholder. That is the control that's bound to a property that raised the error. And so from there, you can just build onto it. It's turtles all the way down. I mean, at the end of the day, you're looking at that property of that particular model.
That is really cool. I never even thought about doing that.
Right. So we talked about change notification. Let's talk about commands, and this is a big one. So here I have commands, and I'm sorry, I've got too many monitors and it keeps popping up on the wrong monitor. So I can click this box, the commands are enabled, unclick it, they're disabled. Silly code. Not really. Think about your typical business user, gets to work in the morning, opens up your application with a bunch of data for a particular customer. As soon as they open it up, the phone rings. They have to go to a meeting down the hall. They go down the hall, they get a cup of coffee. Now it's lunchtime, and they go to lunch, and they come back, they have another meeting, and then they want to talk about the game at the water cooler, and it's now 4:30. They've been at their desk just long enough to open your app, to load up a customer, and they look at your application with this customer, and they're like, crap, did I make any changes? I don't know, I'll be safe. I'll just hit save. And they click save, and nothing happens. Why? Because as developers, we're smart. We're not going to make a trip to the database if we know that the form isn't dirty. So they click save, it doesn't work, so they think, well, maybe they double-click save. Oh, wait, everything's touch. Let me beat the screen. And they finally call support. Well, how we got around this in WinForms, and kind of the same way we do in JavaScript on the web, but in WinForms, I would always write this little method on every single window, enable, disable controls. And based on the state of the form, then I would toggle whether the save button was enabled or disabled. The problem is that now you add a menu for save, now you have a context menu for save, and you got to remember to keep them in sync. Well, what we're doing here is we're actually binding the command to a parameter, and that parameter will determine whether or not the control can execute. So let's look at a very simple command, and we call it the do something command. And there's two methods that we really care about. We care about execute and can execute. So can execute, anytime I notify property change or I notify collection change is raised, the command manager will requery all the commands and say, hey, can you still work? And if you want it to work, you return true out of can execute. If you don't want it to work, you return false out of can execute. And it will just turn off any control that has that command bound to it as the command in XAML. So if you have an isDirty property, like you will see in my source code when you download it, Anytime that notify property changed or property change is raised, I also set the isDirty flag to true, which will then enable the save button, disable the close button, because we want them to either cancel or save it before we let them close the form. Right? So again, the command knows whether it can execute or not. And I know we're probably running out of time. I'm not sure how much time you're giving me, because I'll talk all night, which I know you don't want. So here's my command, right? So I'm binding to the do something command, which is exposed in the view model. It's just a property in the view model. Because remember, the data context for this entire window is the class to view model. That's that second line of code we see in all the code behinds. Then I have a parameter, and I'm using something that's brand new in WPF, brand new for WPF. It's been in WPF the entire time. Something called element binding. So I can actually bind a value to a UI element on the screen. So in this case, I'm binding to this checkbox, and I'm then saying the isChecked property is what I'm going to send in as a command parameter. Now, you would typically bind to the model product.isDirty, right? But again, this is just a silly sample to show you how it works. So that's the command pattern. Absolutely vital to understand as well, because again, we've got that separation concern. The command knows whether it can run or not. So anything that's bound to that command gets turned on or off because the command knows that it should be on or off. The view doesn't have to know how to toggle the state of these buttons and these elements. The command does. And we get this for free if we implement the pattern correctly. All right.
That's really cool.
Figure out if there's do we have time for behaviors?
Sure, do behaviors, because I think they're important.
Okay, so behaviors, and I'm just going to show you what they look like, and you're going to say, boy, it looks like nothing. So let's look at behaviors. I have a grid. You go, yeah, that's not a behavior. No, but I click on the grid and it pops a message box with the model name, and you say, gosh, that's pretty easy, that's just an event. Well, I don't want to use events. I don't like events. What I want is to be able to have a command that will then pop whatever I want to do with that value. So we do this by adding in behaviors, and behaviors are created by the makers of Blend, and they're available for free. You can distribute them with your app, but you have to pull in the system.windows.interactivity namespace as well as the assembly out of the Blend SDK, again, free runtime distribution. And then you have this interaction.triggers. And so it will trigger based on certain interactions that you do. Now, if we, hopefully my IntelliSense is working, and it's not. Oh, that's because I'm running. We'll shut it down real quick. One of those things where it worked in rehearsal. All right.
Works on my machine.
Yeah. If this was pre-recorded, we would edit that out. So now you know it's live because I just had my first demo fail. But we have this mouse left button up. So when they get done clicking, instead of having to tie into the click event of the grid, I say invoke a command. And that command can be anything. Can be save, can be change the price, can be any number of things. In my case, I'm just popping a message box. That is all. So if you're really thinking about what we've talked about, the fact that I popped a message box, I broke all of my rules. Every single one of them. Right? Because now the view model has to know about the view to pop a message box. But what I do, and I'm going to show you this real quick, and then we'll go into the next section. Here's my grid click command. Right? I don't actually pop a message box. I have an interface called iMessenger, and that interface just executes a method. Now, in the view model, that command is getting instantiated, passing in an iMessenger that happens to wrap a message box. In my unit tests, I don't pass in the message box. I pass in a mock object of the iMessenger, and I can verify that the show method gets called with the exact parameter, which is the model name. So I can unit test it without tying up the CI server by popping a message box. And the command in the view model doesn't have any knowledge of the view itself, so I still have separation of concerns. Now, this is a very crude way of doing this. A lot of the frameworks will use event sourcing, pub/sub type patterns to do this. I wanted to keep the sample very simple for people to grok, but know that there are lots of other ways to do this kind of UI interaction without slapping interfaces around them. But anyway, I did want to get that out because somebody would watch this and say, "Wait a minute, MVVM, pop message box, guy's an idiot." No, I'm doing this to actually show that you can do these things still within the realms of the pattern.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest arguments in favor of a move from the model view controller to model view presenter is unit testing of the view interfaces. So how do you achieve this unit test for MVVM?
So you're actually not unit testing the interface, you're unit testing the view model and everything behind it. Okay. So MVVM is actually a derivation of Martin Fowler's presentation model pattern.
Okay.
So it doesn't derive, well, I guess technically it does derive from MVP and MVC, but it's really more closely aligned with PM. And Microsoft got all kinds of flack when it first came out because they're like, "Oh, you're just copying off Martin Fowler and presentation model." Sure. No, they derived it to take advantage of what they built into XAML and C# and VB.NET.
Okay.
So it's a derivation of that.
Okay.
That's awesome. Thanks for the demo, Phil. That was actually very informative.
Solid.
I learned a couple of things too.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to play around with that for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Let me ask you a question, Phil. How did you get involved in speaking?
Well, Mike Wood, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so it had to be at least 10 years ago. I'd been teaching my entire career. Internal classes, Microsoft official curriculum, lots of different teaching. So classroom, lecture style, get up in front, death by PowerPoint, the whole 9 yards. And Mike was running the Cincinnati.NET user group back then, and they had a little code camp here in Cincinnati, and he had a speaker cancel. And he called me, and he said, "Hey, you do teaching? Can you go fill in?" And I'm like, "Sure, I'll fill in. And what do you want me to talk on?" And I did the, well, they weren't called, oh, they were the application blocks back then, the individual application blocks, right? Early days of .NET.
Mm-hmm.
And so I absolutely bored everybody to tears for an hour with way more slides and way more words than I could ever get through, and it was horrendous. It was terrible. But it was my first exposure to community, and what really got me hooked was hanging out with the other speakers. I'm like going, "Oh my gosh, I am like the dumbest person in the room." And that's the place I've always wanted to be, whether it was with the fire department, whether it was school or anything else. I've always wanted to be the dumbest person in the room because then all you can do is learn.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
And that's really what got me into speaking. And then, I pounded the pavement for a couple summers, finding every code camp I could find, and then, fortunately had some breaks. I've been with VS Live now this is my 7th year of speaking for them. I get to speak in Europe at several shows. It's been fantastic, and still really what is best for me is just hanging out with the speakers and just learning from them. Some of your guests, Brian Noyes, Brian Randall, see those guys at VS Live all the time, and I'm just amazed with their knowledge, and I just try and be a sponge and soak it up.
Yeah,
the Matrix can't come fast enough, man. I just want to plug in and upload and good to go, man.
Yeah,
I need to know karate.
Karate. Done.
Yeah, the crazy thing is that's exactly the way I like to play golf too, right? I don't like to play with somebody that shoots as bad as I do. I want to play with somebody that shoots good because I usually play up to that person. Maybe not to their level, but at least a lot better than I normally play.
So what you're saying is you play best lie.
Yes.
All right.
Yep. Yeah, kinda.
So they hit a 300-yard drive, you hit a worm burner, you'll just take your second shot from where they ended up.
No. I still take the second shot, but usually, like stroke-wise, I'm up to it except for putting. But I usually gain 5 to 6 strokes if I'm playing with a lot better golfers. So I don't know what it is. It's just competition, maybe. I don't know.
Embarrassment.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah.
I've been
Come
there.
on, come on. I know you don't suck this bad, dude. No, I
Oh,
don't. No, I
yeah,
don't.
you.
Yeah.
So, Phil, we kind of talked about a little bit of it, but what do you do away from the keyboard? Do you have any hobbies or passions
Well,
other
it's
than schematic?
yeah, I'm still on the National Ski Patrol. Been doing it for over 20 years, and really enjoy skiing and still very involved in the medical community in that sense. I'm one of the instructors for that. Um, Although what I found in this summer, and I play soccer. I coached my kids for many years until they got to the level where they needed to have like 3 or 4 practices a night, and I couldn't do it. And so now they're in club soccer. I bought a boat. And I know
really?
the happiest day, the 2 happiest days in life of any boat owner, the day they buy it and the day they sell it. But we're having a blast. So it's a 19-foot chaparral ski boat. My kids don't ski, but they tube. We go out. Literally, I made the promise to myself, we're going to go out once a week. And if I'm away for a weekend, then we'll go out, because I'm speaking, like I was in Tulsa a couple weeks ago, then we'll go out 2 times the next weekend. Okay. And it forces me to get away from the keyboard. Because I will not bring my Surface on the boat with me, and I'm tinkering with. I'm still tinkering, right? I'm tinkering with the boat, and I broke the depth gauge because I wanted to see what it could do and how to get that replaced. But no, so that's my big summer hobby is turned into boating, and just thrilled to do it. I grew up with boats and hadn't had them for many years, playing soccer all year round, indoor soccer, and then skiing in the winter.
Oh, cool.
Nice.
Cool. Real active. That's good. I'm glad to hear it.
For sure.
Yep.
That's different from what we've heard before, so we always like different variety.
Yeah.
Cool.
Definitely.
Absolutely. So that concludes our basically our code section of the show. Let's go ahead and move on to one of the questions that you actually decided to choose, and that was, how do you see technology changing in the next 3 to 5 years?
I think it's about voice and gesture. I think we're going to. I honestly think we're going to leapfrog touch.
Okay.
And get in the Minority Report. Because we've got a generation of people who grew up with the keyboards. Right. We've got a generation of people coming that don't have keyboards because they've been using an iPad as a pacifier for so many years.
Oh, totally.
It's
which, by the way, I'm not not you, but our listeners, don't put a screen in front of a kid just to do it. That's not a good idea. Do something constructive with that. So that's my.
Yeah, unless they're crying really loudly. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
No, it's I really think, the technology. I mean, if you think about it, Microsoft invented the first pen computer. They just didn't know how to market it.
Yep.
Sure.
And touch and everything else. It just happens to be that Steve Jobs was brilliant at marketing it and claiming that he invented the colored phone. And
sure.
We're gonna go right past that because the I guess they're called millennials. Right?
Yep,
the kids are coming in. I just saw an article on MSN today, as a matter of fact, that kind of went through. Here are the things that 19-year-olds today never experienced. Right? They never didn't have internet. Right? They never didn't have. Heck, I still remember the remote control was me for the TV because I was the youngest in the house. Right?
Yep, exactly.
Oh, get up, change channel. Right? Why me? Because you're the youngest and I'm bigger. So it's going to be voice. It's going to be touch. It's touch as a fallback, right? Gesture. I think gesture is so important. I really want to be able to wave at my computer and have it wave back. And that from an interface perspective, but also this whole Internet of Things, right? I was a big fan of Eureka, and I loved the sheriff's house. I don't know if you ever saw that show.
Oh yeah. But
definitely. He would walk into the house, and I can't remember her name. They had a name for her. And she'd be like, "Sheriff, have you had a bad day? Your blood pressure's a little high, and you're perspiring. Let me make you a nice cup of tea." Right? Which is also kind of Skynet, right? Sure. Which we got to worry about. But I just think that the power is there. We've got to break out of this mold of cylinder, square, circle is every application, and just come up with new ideas. And I think the kids that aren't chained to a keyboard like I am, they're going to come up with that. They're like, well, why don't we do it this way? And some 50-year-old like me is going to go, because we've never done it that way. And they're just going to do it, right? And this stuff's going to be here.
Well, and it has to be kind of ubiquitous with that sense of an Apple-esque to it, where it can appeal to pediatrics and geriatrics and cover the gamut in between.
Right.
That's kind of one of the biggest things. The other thing is like the leap motion, where we I can't remember his name, the Elon Musk, maybe he was the guy, but that's the certain sense of being able to inspect things and not literally not have to touch anything, like you said. And I do think that there's a market for that, and we've seen, I have seen some prototypes of turning just a normal webcam into an infrared sensor to where you can, control and not necessarily need to connect. So, if you can house make some of that stuff, I do see the technologies coming in our devices and our Internet of Things, and that does excite me. And that's one of those things where I always, when we get into this particular conversation, I'm always like, guys, privacy has to be in the conversation. I'm not saying it has to be in the conversation because we need to protect ourselves. What I'm saying is that is a hurdle in which we have to somehow reconcile with people who aren't willing to relinquish certain information. And when you get into programming, obviously the last thing you want is restrictions, right? Yeah. You want data to go in and come out as easy as humanly possible. And coding as possible. So I see that as a big challenge. Do you share that sentiment?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, matter of fact, it was funny. We were talking about this last night at my user group. I would love to, and we've written facial recognition prototypes using Connect and other things. And what I would love to have is, I walk into Micro Center, local computer store, and it says, "Oh, hi Phil, welcome back. Last time you were here, you were looking in the keyboard section, and by the way, this is the keyboard you held for the longest before you didn't buy a keyboard."
Yeah, nice.
Right? And have it, because that data's there, right? And so instead of me going back to the 2 entire racks of keyboards going, crap, what was I looking at? Right? It just knows. But I'd be cool with that.
Sure.
I don't know that everybody would, right? So I think the privacy has to be a factor. It's got to be something you opt into. It's got to be, and the problem is, it's not because of us. It's not because of the shopper. It's because of the bad guys.
Sure.
Very true. Very true.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah.
You look at what happened to Target, right? And it wasn't even so much a data breach as a social engineering breach.
Yeah,
totally.
Right.
And that's the problem, right? Once you start doing all this facial recognition, there's good to it, but it'd be interesting to know more about, because London, like, everybody is all the time on camera. And how do they protect that data, right? I mean, it's a solvable problem.
Oh, yeah.
But you've always got to stay one step ahead of the bad guys.
Totally agree with you wholeheartedly on that one.
Yeah.
And social engineering is one of the worst ways, that you can hurt a company. We'll put it that way.
Yep.
In my opinion.
Totally. I'm telling you, you could probably make more money if you try just to be legit hackers instead of bad ones. So that was awesome. We really enjoyed that. Tell us a little bit about Gus. Why don't you go ahead and get us started with the announcements that we have for this week?
Sure. We have a couple upcoming shows booked. One is with Xamarin. The Xamarin guys are going to come on and show us some of their new stuff, Xamarin Forums, and a few other things. We also have the one of the creators of Track.js coming on to talk about that, and that's client-side JavaScript tracking. So they're able to log errors on the client side and report them back to your company, which I think is fantastic, and I can't wait to see how that works.
For sure.
And I'll be at Dev Connection September 15th through the 19th in Vegas. That's me. JJ, how about you?
I'll be at Strange Loop, Start Louis, Startup Voodoo, which is kind of like South by Southwest for St. Louis. I'll also be at stlouisdaisy.net, and me and you and the team are going to be presenting the pre-compiler session of the stlouisdaisy.net. So hopefully Phil can stop by and say hello.
Well, I'll be actually presenting a pre-compiler myself, so I won't be able to start.
Well, then you can throw something against the wall and we'll hear you. No, exciting stuff coming down the pipe here. So speaking of that, Phil, what do you have coming up?
So in the immediate near future, I've got CodeCamp New York City. I've got VS Live Washington D.C. First time they've gone to Washington D.C. Of course, the big one in Orlando, which is 4 conferences, 1 for VS Live.
Yep.
And then StLouisData.net, I'll be there. I'm doing a workshop on XAML, actually,
Cool.
all the way from
Nice.
WPF to Windows 8 and Windows Phone,
Nice.
and then a couple other talks. And that's mostly. I got a trip to Finland, but that's work.
Oh,
Right,
that'll
well,
be fun though.
still fun. Our session will be how to create an application from start to finish and push it out the door, so you walk out with a functional application for Windows 8.
Oh,
So
cool.
That's our goal.
Awesome.
But no, I thank you for your support of the Windows Phone community, by the way.
Yeah.
So having said that, Gus, was there anything you wanted to add to the end of this wonderful episode, sir?
I just wanted to thank Phil for coming on, giving such a great demo. You're a good friend. I love hanging out with you at conferences and all the other smart people. Make me feel stupid, and yeah, which is true. But can't wait to see you at the next conference that we're at together, which I think is St. Louis.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And by the way, we skipped right past my contact information. So can we throw that
whoops.
out there?
No. I'm getting ready to say it.
Oh, okay.
So
Then we
you
didn't
can
skip it.
You can find Phil at SKIMEDIC. That is on Twitter, so that's at SKIMEDIC.
And that's
Or go to the
That's ski medic, so snow ski paramedic.
right. So ski medic. Wow, I'm starting to say that, I feel like a machine in my own right. Also, check out skimedic.com. So it's exactly what I said 3-4 times ago, and it's just skimedic.com. It's real easy. So I hope everybody goes there and contacts you about this wonderful presentation, and we would love to have you back on the show to talk about those other 2 things you wanted to discuss that were possible tangents, which, believe you me, we could have got off on, but we got to keep this under because we only have so many attention spans of us, of all of us. So anyway, so thank you so much for being on the show. From me to you, we really appreciate you coming by. We just can't thank you enough, sir.
Yeah.
Oh no, it was fun. I appreciate doing it.
Oh,
all right,
Glad to be
very
here.
And for everyone else, also look up your podcast too, Hallway Conversations. Great podcast.
Oh yeah.
Really good content. Definitely worth a listen.
Okay, guys, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if you want all my contact information, go to about.me/skimedic. So I'm skimedic everywhere. So
Perfect.
about.me/skimedic. It's got links to all that stuff.
Awesome.
Yep. So charities you should all know about: Hopeline and domestic violence program prevention and support for the Women's Safe House here in St. Louis, Safe Connections in St. Louis here, the Schumann Water Organization, the Hope for Young Adults with Cancer. So we're going to have that in our show notes. Again, thank you, Phil, for coming out and just being cool and doing what you do. Thank you again, Gus, for everything you do as well. So thank you. And to our fans, we love and thank you for your support of the show. So from the entire STL Tech Talk crew, good coding. We're out.